Grace Whitaker knew the desert by heart. Every ridge, every shadow, every place where a man might hide. She had grown up under the merciless New Mexico sun, had breathed its dust since she was old enough to ride. Dust that now coated her throat as she urged her mare forward through the narrow canyon, rifle balanced across her saddle. "Easy, Belle," she whispered, patting the horse's neck as the animal's ears pricked forward nervously. Something wasn't right. The air hung still and silent, too silent for comfort. Even the cicadas had ceased their relentless chorus. Grace tightened her grip on the rifle, her blue eyes narrowing against the glare. She shouldn't have ventured this far from town alone. Her father would be furious if he knew, but at 22 she had grown weary of always being the sheriff's daughter, protected, watched, confined. The faint track she followed vanished among the scattered boulders, forcing her to dismount and lead Belle by the reins. 10 paces forward, she froze. Dark spatters stained the sand, blood, still fresh enough to glisten in the sunlight. Her heart quickened as she traced the crimson trail with her eyes to where it disappeared behind a cluster of scrub brush. Every instinct told her to turn back, to fetch her father and his deputies. Sheriff Thomas Whitaker had raised her on stories of Apache ambushes, of settlers found mutilated beneath the vast, indifferent sky. Especially now, with that devil Nahuel leading raids across the territory, her father's voice echoed in her mind. Yet something else, something she couldn't name, drew her forward. The blood trail spoke of injury, of vulnerability. If someone was hurt. Grace secured Belle to a twisted juniper and moved silently, her boots barely disturbing the sand. The rifle's weight felt reassuring against her shoulder as she rounded the brush. What she saw made her breath catch. A man lay motionless against the rock face, one leg stretched awkwardly before him, the other bent at the knee. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Blood had soaked through a crude bandage on his thigh, and more trickled from a gash above his right temple. But it was not his wounds that made Grace's finger tighten on the trigger. It was the unmistakable features of his face, the high cheekbones, the copper skin darkened by sun and wind, the straight black hair falling past his shoulders. Apache. The man's eyes suddenly snapped open, dark and fierce as a hawk's. They locked onto hers with such intensity that Grace felt a chill race down her spine despite the heat. Neither moved, neither breathed. Then his gaze dropped to her rifle, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear, but a quiet acceptance that unsettled her even more. "You are Thomas Whitaker's daughter." His voice was low, accented but clear, each word carefully formed in English. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Grace couldn't hide her surprise. "How do you know who I am?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Everyone knows the sheriff's blue-eyed daughter who rides like she was born to it." He shifted slightly, wincing. "I have seen you at the trading post, from a distance." She should have been alarmed that he had watched her, yet curiosity overrode caution. "You're bleeding badly." "Yes." Again, that simple acceptance. "The bullet passed through, but the wound reopened. I cannot go farther today." Grace studied him more carefully. His clothes were a mixture of Apache and white man's garments, buckskin leggings, a faded cotton shirt torn at the shoulder. A knife sheath hung at his waist, but it was empty. Around his neck, partially hidden by his shirt, she glimpsed what appeared to be a silver medallion. Then comprehension struck her like a physical blow. The sheriff's notices, posted in every town from Santa Fe to El Paso. The sketches that never quite captured a face but described a tall Apache who wore a stolen silver medallion. The man her father had spent months hunting. "You're Nahuel," she whispered, bringing the rifle up again. "The one they say led the raid on Fletcher's ranch. 15 dead." Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, pain, she couldn't tell. "I am Nahuel," he acknowledged, "but I led no raid on any ranch. That blood is not on my hands." Grace gave a harsh laugh. "That's what all the wanted men say." "Yet you haven't shot me," he observed, "or gone for your father." The simple truth of his words unsettled her. Why hadn't she? The logical part of her mind screamed that this man was dangerous, an enemy to her people. The reward for his capture would fund the town's new schoolhouse twice over. But another part, a part she rarely acknowledged, whispered that something didn't fit. The man before her was clearly weakened by his wounds, yet he maintained a dignity that contradicted the savage killer from her father's descriptions. And his eyes, They held pain, wariness, but not the cold emptiness she had seen in truly dangerous men. "You should," he continued when she remained silent. "Your father would be proud. The great Nahuel, brought down by the sheriff's daughter." The hint of bitterness in his voice sparked her temper. "I don't need my father's approval for my decisions." Even as she said it, Grace knew it wasn't entirely true. Her entire life had been shaped by Thomas Whitaker's expectations. Nahuel studied her face. "Then what will you decide, Grace Whitaker?" The sound of her name in his mouth sent an unexpected shiver through her. The sensible choice was clear. Ride back to town, bring her father and his men. This man was accused of terrible crimes. Yet doubt gnawed at her. What if he was telling the truth? Her father's justice was swift and final, especially for an Apache. "You'll die if that wound isn't treated properly," she said at last, lowering her rifle slightly. "Yes." His calm acceptance of death disturbed her. Grace made her decision in a heartbeat, knowing it might be the most foolish choice of her life. "There's an old line shack about half a mile east of here. Used to belong to the Wilson spread before they sold out. Nobody uses it now." She kept her voice even, matter of fact. "If someone were to hole up there, they wouldn't be found." Surprise flickered across his features. "Why would you tell me this?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Maybe because I believe everyone deserves a fair hearing before they're judged. Or maybe I'm just a fool." She stepped back, rifle still ready, but no longer aimed at his heart. "Can you walk?" He nodded once, then with careful movements braced himself against the rock and pushed to his feet. Pain flashed across his face, quickly controlled, but Grace saw how heavily he leaned on his good leg. "I need to return to town before I'm missed," she said. "My father has men watching for you all over the territory. They won't look twice at me, but they'd shoot you on sight." Something unreadable passed through his eyes. "Why risk yourself for a stranger?" "An enemy." Grace wasn't sure she had an answer. "I don't know that you're either, not yet." She hesitated, then added, "I'll come back tomorrow with supplies. If you're gone, so be it. If not—" She let the words hang between them. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply holding her gaze with an intensity that made her feel strangely exposed, as if he could see beyond her careful composure to the doubts and questions beneath. "Until tomorrow then, Grace Whitaker," he finally said, a formal quality to his words that reminded her of a promise, or perhaps a warning. As she rode back toward town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she had just altered the course of her life irrevocably. For better or worse remained to be seen. The old line shack stood like a forgotten tombstone against the vast emptiness of the New Mexico sky. Its weathered planks had gone silver with age, the roof sagging at one corner where a support beam had begun to rot. Grace approached cautiously, her saddlebags heavy with supplies she'd smuggled from town. There was no sign of movement, no hint that the wounded Apache had found his way here. Perhaps he'd fled during the night, choosing to take his chances in the wilderness rather than trust a white woman's word. Or perhaps his wounds had proven too severe, and he lay dead somewhere among the rocks and scrub brush. The thought disturbed her more than it should have. Grace dismounted, tethering Belle to a stunted pine near a patch of sparse grass. The mare nickered softly, sensing her tension. "Easy, girl," she murmured, patting the animal's neck before turning toward the shack. Her hand moved instinctively to the revolver at her hip, her father's old Colt, given to her on her 16th birthday. Grace had never drawn it in anger, but she'd put enough bullets through practice targets to know she could use it if necessary. The door hung slightly ajar, its rusted hinges protesting as she pushed it open. The interior was dim after the harsh sunlight, and Grace blinked, allowing her eyes to adjust. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that spilled through a small window. The space was spare, a crude table, a broken chair, a narrow cot against the far wall. Empty. Disappointment washed over her, followed immediately by self-reproach. What had she expected? That a hunted man would simply wait for her, trusting in the goodwill of the sheriff's daughter. "You came." Grace whirled around, drawing the Colt in one fluid motion. Nahuel stood in the doorway of what must have been a storage room, his tall frame filling the narrow space. He had fashioned a crude crutch from a broken fence post, relieving the weight on his injured leg. In the dim light, his face seemed more angular, the shadows emphasizing the sharp lines of his cheekbones and jaw. "I said I would," she replied, lowering the gun but not holstering it. His eyes dropped to the weapon, then back to her face. "Trust comes slowly between our peoples. Can you blame us?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. No. He moved carefully to the table, leaning heavily on the makeshift crutch. "Just as you cannot blame my people for defending what was always theirs." There was no anger in his voice, only a resigned certainty that made any argument she might offer seem hollow. Grace set her saddlebags on the table, conscious of his watchful gaze. "I brought bandages, whiskey for the wound, some jerky and hardtack." She hesitated. "And these." From the bottom of the bag, she withdrew a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. "Willow bark for the pain. The old medicine woman in town showed me how to prepare it." Surprise flickered across his features. "You know of our medicines?" "Some. Martha, the medicine woman, is half Mexican, half Pueblo. She's lived in the territory longer than anyone." Grace unwrapped the packet, revealing dried bark strips. "She treats those the doctor won't see." Nahuel's expression softened slightly. "Your father permits this?" "My father doesn't know everything I do." Grace met his gaze steadily. "Now let me see that wound." He hesitated, and she understood his reluctance. To allow her near him to expose his injury was to place himself entirely at her mercy. For a man hunted like an animal, such vulnerability must seem an impossible risk. "I could have brought my father yesterday," she said quietly. "I didn't." Something shifted in his eyes, not quite trust, but a grudging acknowledgement. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the broken chair and extended his injured leg. Grace knelt beside him, setting her revolver on the floor within reach. The crude bandage he'd applied was soaked through with blood and dirt. "This needs to come off." She reached for the knife at her belt. His hand shot out, closing around her wrist with surprising strength. "What are you doing?" "Cutting away the bandage," she said calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. His grip was warm, calloused, a warrior's hand. "Unless you prefer I tear it off." After a moment he released her. "My apologies." Grace worked in silence, carefully slicing through the stiffened cloth. Beneath it, the wound was angry and red, though not as bad as she had feared. The bullet had indeed passed through the fleshy part of his thigh, missing bone and major blood vessels. Still, infection was a constant danger in the harsh desert environment. "This will hurt," she warned, uncorking the whiskey bottle. Nahuel nodded once, his face impassive. Not a muscle twitched as she poured the liquor over the wound, though she knew the pain must be excruciating. His only reaction was a slight tightening around his eyes, a controlled exhale through his nose. As she worked to clean and rebandage the injury, Grace found herself acutely aware of him in a way that confused and unsettled her. The lean strength of his leg beneath her hands, the scent of him, smoke and sage and something uniquely male, the steady rhythm of his breathing, carefully controlled. "Where did you learn English?" she asked, needing to break the strange tension that had developed between them. "The mission school, when I was a boy." His voice was neutral, but she sensed hidden depths beneath the simple statement. "Before I returned to my people." "You chose to go back?" Most children taken to the mission schools were deliberately kept from their tribes, taught to reject their heritage. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I escaped, after 3 years of being told my language was the devil's tongue and my gods were false." Grace finished wrapping the clean bandage around his thigh, securing it with a neat knot. "There, keep it dry and clean if you can." She rose, dusting off her skirt. "How did you come to be wounded?" Nahuel's expression closed. "Army patrol. They've been hunting me since the Fletcher massacre." "The massacre you claim you didn't commit. I don't just claim it, it is truth." He met her eyes, and the intensity she saw there made her breath catch. "I have killed men, Grace Whitaker. I won't deny that. But I've never raised my hand against women or children." "Then why does every lawman in the territory say otherwise?" She leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Because someone needs to be blamed." Bitterness edged his words. "Because it's easier to hunt one Apache than to admit that men wearing army blue might slaughter a family and blame it on Indians." The accusation hung in the air between them, terrible in its implications. "That's a serious charge to make against U.S. soldiers." "Is it so hard to believe?" He gestured to his leg. "This bullet came from men who shot without warning, without asking questions. Men who would have put another in my head if I hadn't managed to escape." Grace wanted to deny it, to defend the institutions she'd been raised to respect, but she'd seen enough in her 22 years to know that a uniform didn't guarantee honor, that a badge, even one like her father's, didn't ensure justice. "My father believes you're guilty," she said softly. "Your father sees what he expects to see." Nahuel's voice held no judgment, only a sad certainty. "As most men do." "And what do you see when you look at me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. For a long moment he studied her face, his dark eyes unreadable. "I see a woman caught between worlds, between what she has been taught and what her heart tells her." His perception unsettled her. "You don't know me." "Perhaps not." That ghost of a smile returned. "Yet you are here." The simple statement held more truth than Grace cared to acknowledge. Why had she come back? What was it about this man that had made her risk everything? Her reputation, her relationship with her father, perhaps even her safety, to help him. She gathered the soiled bandages, turning away from his too perceptive gaze. "I should go. I told my father I was visiting Martha for more of her headache remedy. If I'm gone too long, he'll grow suspicious." "Will you come again?" The question was asked casually, but Grace heard the underlying tension. She hesitated. The sensible answer was no. She had done her Christian duty, tended to his wounds. To continue this dangerous association was foolishness of the highest order. Yet even as these thoughts passed through her mind, Grace knew she would return. Something about Nahuel called to her, a pull she couldn't explain or resist. "Yes," she said simply. "In 2 days. I can't get away sooner without raising questions." Nahuel nodded, accepting her words without pressing for more. As she gathered her things, he reached beneath his shirt and withdrew the silver medallion she had glimpsed the day before. In the dim light, she could now see that it bore the image of a mountain lion, meticulously etched into the metal. "If I am gone when you return," he said, holding it out to her, "take this, to remember." Grace stared at the offered medallion. "That's what they say marks you as the raid leader. If you're found with it missing, then they will say I discarded it to avoid identification." His hand remained extended. "It was my father's. It is all I have of him." The significance of the gesture was not lost on her. She was being offered not just a trinket, but a piece of his heritage, his identity. Slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the medallion. Its weight felt substantial in her palm, warm from contact with his skin. "I will keep it safe," she promised, tucking it into her pocket. "But I expect to return it to you myself." As she mounted Belle for the ride back to town, Grace felt Nahuel's eyes following her, a sensation both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. The medallion pressed against her thigh through the fabric of her pocket, a tangible reminder of the secret she now carried, a secret that could destroy them both. 5 visits became 10, 10 became 20. With each journey to the line shack, Grace told herself it would be the last, that once Nahuel was fully healed, she would stop this dangerous game. Yet as the weeks passed and summer heat gave way to the cooler days of early autumn, she found herself inventing increasingly elaborate excuses to slip away from town. Nahuel's wound had healed cleanly, the angry red gash fading to a silver scar that tracked across his thigh. He no longer needed the crutch, moving with the same fluid grace she imagined he'd possessed before the injury. Grace told herself she continued to visit out of concern, to ensure his recovery, but the lie rang hollow even in her own mind. The truth was both simpler and more frightening. She had come to crave their time together. Today, she approached the line shack to find him waiting outside, seated on a flat boulder, his face turned toward the sun. He had fashioned a small lean-to against the side of the shack, where he slept on warm nights beneath the vast canopy of stars. Sometimes he told her stories of those stars, how the Milky Way was the path taken by souls journeying to the afterlife, how the morning star guided warriors home from battle. He rose as she dismounted, and Grace noticed he had braided his hair, decorated with a single hawk feather. The sight made her inexplicably self-conscious of her own appearance. The simple blue dress she'd worn instead of her usual riding clothes, the way she'd pinned her hair more carefully than usual. "You're early today," he said, his slight accent caressing the words in a way that never failed to send a shiver down her spine. "Father's riding to Santa Fe with 2 deputies. Won't be back until tomorrow." She removed a bundle from her saddlebag. "I brought fresh cornbread." And this. From a separate pouch, she withdrew a small leather-bound book. Curiosity lit his features. Over the weeks, they had developed a ritual. Grace would bring a book, poetry mostly, or sometimes stories, and read aloud while Nahuel listened, occasionally asking questions about words or concepts unfamiliar to him. It had begun as a way to pass time, but had evolved into something more intimate, a sharing of minds, of perspectives. "Wordsworth today?" he asked, recognizing the volume. Grace nodded, pleased that he remembered. "I thought we could sit by the creek. It's cooler there." The small stream ran a quarter-mile from the shack, its banks lined with cottonwoods that offered blessed shade from the relentless New Mexico sun. It was a spot they had visited several times before, a neutral ground between their worlds. They walked in comfortable silence, Grace leading Belle by the reins. The mare had grown accustomed to Nahuel's presence, no longer shying away when he approached. Like her mistress, Belle had learned to trust what she had been taught to fear. At the creek, Grace spread a small blanket beneath the largest cottonwood. The familiar domesticity of the action struck her suddenly. How easy it had become to share this space with him, how natural their companionship now felt. "Tell me of the town," Nahuel said as they settled on the blanket. "What news?" It was another of their rituals. Grace would share the happenings of Cimarron, harmless gossip mostly, carefully avoiding anything that might touch on the ongoing search for him. Though she suspected he asked partly to gauge his own safety, she had come to believe his interest was genuine, his questions a way of understanding her world. "Mrs. Hargrove's daughter is engaged to the banker's son," she reported. "Everyone's scandalized because she's only 16, but Mrs. Hargrove says better a wealthy husband now than spinsterhood later." "And what does the daughter say?" Grace smiled at the question, so typical of him. While others in town focused on the propriety of the match or the financial advantages, Nahuel invariably considered the individuals involved, especially those with the least power. "Sarah seems happy enough, though I can't imagine being married so young." Grace plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. "My father expects I'll wed James Porter when he returns from law school in Boston next spring." She hadn't meant to share this, had scarcely acknowledged it to herself, but the words slipped out naturally, as so many confidences did in Nahuel's presence. His expression remained unchanged, but she noticed the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "Is this your wish?" he asked carefully. "It's what's expected." Grace kept her eyes on the twisting grass blade. "James is well respected, educated. He'll likely be appointed judge someday. My father says it's a perfect match." "You didn't answer my question." The gentle persistence in his voice made her look up. Nahuel was watching her with that intensity that seemed to see through all her careful defenses to the truth beneath. "No," she admitted softly. "It isn't my wish. James is. He's a good man, I suppose. But he talks at me, not to me. He has my future planned to the last detail, and never once has he asked what I might want." "And what do you want, Grace Whitaker?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. What did she want? A year ago she might have said a comfortable home, a respectable husband, children, the life every proper young woman was taught to desire. Now, "I want to choose my own path," she said finally. "I want to see what lies beyond the boundaries others have set for me. I want—" "You," her heart whispered. The realization struck with the force of a physical blow. Somewhere amid their conversations, their shared silences, the careful dance of growing trust, Grace had fallen in love with Nahuel. The impossibility of it was breathtaking. The daughter of Sheriff Whitaker and the Apache warrior he had sworn to bring to justice. Nahuel seemed to read the unspoken thought in her eyes. Slowly, with the deliberate care he brought to all his movements, he reached out and took her hand. His skin was warm against hers, calloused from a life lived close to the elements. "In my language there is a word," he said softly. "Tsalgai. It means where the water runs through white rocks. But it also means a place where separate streams join to become one river, where what was divided becomes whole." Grace stared at their joined hands, his copper dark against her sun-browned paleness. "Is such a thing possible, between people like us?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I have never met anyone like you, Grace. Someone who sees with her heart as well as her eyes." The tenderness in his voice broke something open inside her. Without stopping to think, to consider the consequences, Grace leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. For an instant, Nahuel went utterly still and she feared she had misjudged terribly. Then his hand came up to cradle her cheek, and he was kissing her back with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. It was nothing like the hasty, stolen kisses James had pressed on her beneath the church eaves. Those had left her cold and slightly uncomfortable. This was heat and light, and a sense of coming home she had never known she was seeking. When they finally parted, Grace kept her eyes closed, afraid of what she might see in his face, afraid too of the enormity of what she had just done. Grace. The way he said her name, like a prayer, like a promise, made her open her eyes. There was wonder in his gaze, and beneath it a cautious joy that mirrored her own confusion of feelings. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, though she couldn't bring herself to regret it. "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But I'm glad you did." A branch snapped in the underbrush nearby, and they jerked apart the moment shattered. Belle whickered nervously, pulling at her tether. Grace's hand went instinctively to her revolver as Nahuel rose in one fluid motion, positioning himself between her and the potential threat. A jackrabbit burst from the brush, freezing for an instant in startled recognition before bounding away into the scrub. Grace released a shaky breath, but the spell had been broken. Reality crashed back. The danger of their situation, the impossibility of what had just passed between them. "I should go," she said, rising and brushing dust from her skirt with trembling hands. Nahuel nodded, though regret shadowed his features. "It isn't safe for you to be seen with me. If your father knew, he would never understand." The truth of it ached in her chest. Thomas Whitaker was a man of rigid principles. In his world, there were no shades of grey, only right and wrong, lawful and criminal, white and Indian. The daughter who had always been his pride would become an unforgivable disappointment. Grace gathered the untouched book and blanket, her movements quick and jerky. Confusion and fear warred with the lingering warmth of Nahuel's kiss. What madness had possessed her? What impossible future had she imagined in that moment of surrender? As if reading her thoughts, Nahuel gently caught her wrist. "Grace, do not torment yourself. What passes between us—" He hesitated, searching for words. "It is like water finding its path through stone. Not something we chose, but something that simply is." The poetry of his words touched her even through her turmoil. This was part of what had drawn her to him. His ability to see the world in ways her own people rarely did, to find beauty and meaning in the hardest realities. "I don't regret it," she said softly. "But I'm afraid, Nahuel, not just for myself but for you. If we're discovered—" He nodded, understanding all she didn't say. The consequences for him would be far worse than any she might face. A white woman caught with an Apache man, especially one wanted for murder, would bring violence swift and terrible. "I have remained here too long already," he acknowledged. "The longer I stay near Cimarron, the greater the danger." Fear clutched at Grace's heart. "You're leaving?" "Soon, I must. There are others of my band who escaped the reservation. They have gone south toward Mexico. I promised to join them when I could travel safely." The thought of him gone, of never seeing him again, was a physical pain, yet Grace knew he was right. Each day he stayed increased the risk of discovery. Her father had not abandoned the search, though it had become less active as the weeks passed without sightings. "When?" she asked, the single word carrying all her unspoken grief. "After the next full moon. The nights will be dark enough then to travel without being seen." 3 days. She had 3 days left with him. Impulsively, Grace reached into her pocket and withdrew the silver medallion he had given her weeks before. She had carried it with her every day, a secret talisman. "You should take this back. For your journey." Nahuel closed her fingers around the medallion, pressing it back into her palm. "Keep it still. A part of me with you." His eyes held hers, intense and solemn. "I will return for it." "Nahuel, I will return," he repeated, the promise burning in his voice. "This is not an ending, Grace Whitaker, only a pause in our story." She wanted desperately to believe him. Yet as she mounted Belle for the ride back to town, the weight of the medallion in her pocket felt like a stone upon her heart. Grace had always believed that heartbreak was a dramatic thing, tears and wailing, a visible collapse. She had not expected this hollow ache, This ability to move through her days with a smile that never reached her eyes while inside, something vital slowly withered. 2 days had passed since her last visit to the line shack. Tomorrow, Nahuel would begin his journey south, and she would be left with nothing but memories and a silver medallion she dared not wear. Grace had promised to come once more before he left. One final meeting, one last goodbye. She had spent the night imagining what she would say, how she would bear the parting. Now, as dawn broke over the eastern mountains, she moved through the quiet house with mechanical precision, preparing for the day. Her father had returned from Santa Fe late the previous night, bringing with him news that had kept the household in turmoil until well past midnight. "We've got the bastard," Thomas Whitaker had announced, slamming his fist on the dinner table with grim satisfaction. "That Apache devil who led the Fletcher raid. Army patrol spotted him near the old Wilson place. We ride at noon today." The words had frozen Grace's blood. Only years of practice at concealing her feelings had prevented her from betraying herself. "Are they certain it's him?" she had managed to ask, her voice remarkably steady, despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Got a good look at him," her father confirmed. "Tall fellow with a silver medallion. Matches the description perfectly. Been hiding out there for weeks, apparently. Slippery as an eel. Patrol lost him in the rocks, but he can't have gone far. Not with that leg wound they gave him." Grace had excused herself soon after, claiming fatigue. In the sanctuary of her room, panic had overwhelmed her. How had Nahuel been spotted? Had she been careless, led someone to him without realizing? The thought that she might have inadvertently betrayed him was unbearable. Now, as the house stirred to life around her, Grace forced herself to think clearly. Her father and his men would ride at noon. She needed to reach Nahuel before then, warn him to flee immediately rather than waiting for nightfall. The medallion pressed against her skin where she had hung it on a leather cord around her neck, hidden beneath her high-collared blouse. A reminder of what was at stake, of what she stood to lose. "Grace?" Her father's voice came from the doorway of the kitchen where she was mechanically kneading dough for the morning bread. "You're up early." Thomas Whitaker was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, with a face weathered by years under the New Mexico sun. The silver at his temples had spread in recent years, but his blue eyes, the same shade as Grace's own, remained sharp and clear. He wore his authority as naturally as other men wore their skin, comfortable with the power his badge represented. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, forcing a smile. "Thought I'd get a head start on the baking." He studied her face with the shrewd assessment that had made him a feared interrogator of suspects. "You feeling all right? You've been quiet since I got back." "Just tired," Grace lied. "And I have a headache coming on. I thought I might ride out to Martha's later for some of her willow bark tea." The excuse had worked before. It would work again. Martha's home lay in the same general direction as the line shack, providing the perfect cover for her illicit visits. Her father grunted, accepting the explanation. "Don't go too far from town. Not with that Apache still on the loose." "I'll be careful," she promised, the words catching in her throat. Each lie felt like a small betrayal, not just of her father, but of the person she had once been, the daughter who had never questioned, never doubted. Thomas nodded, pouring himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "We'll have that murderer by sundown. Then maybe folks around here can sleep easier." Grace kept her eyes on the dough, kneading with more force than necessary. "What if—" she began, then hesitated. "What if he's not what everyone thinks? What if he's innocent of the Fletcher massacre?" Her father's cup paused halfway to his lips. "What kind of talk is that?" "I just mean, we've never actually proven he led that raid. What if someone else was responsible?" Thomas Whitaker set his cup down with deliberate care. "I've been sheriff in this territory for 15 years, Grace. In that time, I've learned that Indians, especially Apache, are savages at heart. They understand only one language, force." His voice hardened. 16 people died at Fletcher's ranch, women and children among them. I saw the bodies myself. Don't you go getting soft-hearted over some murdering redskin." The casual cruelty of his words, the absolute certainty with which he condemned an entire people, struck Grace like a physical blow. How had she never noticed this before? Or had she simply accepted it, unquestioning, as part of the world in which she lived? "I should get this bread in the oven," she said quietly, unable to meet his eyes. Her father studied her for a moment longer, then seemed to dismiss his concerns. "I'll be at the office. Make sure you're back from Martha's by midday. I don't want you out there while we're hunting." Once he had gone, Grace abandoned all pretense of baking. She changed quickly into her riding clothes, strapping her revolver to her hip and packing a small bag with provisions. If she moved quickly, she could reach the line shack and be back before her father gathered his posse at noon. The morning air was crisp as she rode out, fall asserting itself against the lingering heat of summer. Grace pushed Belle harder than usual, the urgency of her mission driving her forward. The familiar landscape passed in a blur of red rock and sage, the scent of juniper sharp in her nostrils. As she approached the line shack, a sense of foreboding settled over her. The usual stillness of the place felt different somehow, watchful, tense. Grace slowed Belle to a walk, eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. The shack door stood partly open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Nahuel never left it that way. Grace dismounted, drawing her revolver. "Nahuel?" she called softly, approaching the doorway with caution. No answer came from within. Heart pounding, she pushed the door wider, stepping into the dim interior. The small space appeared undisturbed at first glance. The table still held the tin cup she had brought weeks earlier. The blanket lay folded on the narrow cot. But then she saw it, a dark stain on the wooden floor near the back room. Blood. Panic rose in her throat. "Nahuel!" she called again, louder this time. A soft sound from the storage room drew her attention. Grace moved toward it, revolver ready, fear and hope warring within her. She found him slumped against the far wall, one hand pressed to his side where a growing bloodstain darkened his shirt. His face was drawn with pain, his normally warm copper skin ashen. Grace. Her name on his lips was barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have come, not safe." She was on her knees beside him in an instant, setting the revolver aside to examine his wound. What happened? Who did this? Army patrol. He winced as she gently moved his hand to reveal a deep knife wound just below his ribs. "Yesterday, near sunset. I was careless. Thought I'd lost them in the rocks, but one circled back." Grace felt sick. This was worse than a bullet wound, deeper, more dangerous. "Why didn't you leave? Head south immediately." "Couldn't travel. Not like this." His dark eyes held hers. "And I promised to see you once more." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet dignity, broke something inside her. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Tears would not help him now. "My father knows you're here," she said, tearing a strip from her petticoat to fashion a fresh bandage. "Not exactly where, but close enough. They're riding out at noon to hunt you down." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then it seems my time has run out." "No," Grace's voice was fierce. "I won't let them take you." "What would you do, Grace Whitaker? Shoot your own father to protect an Apache?" The question hung between them, terrible in its implications. Would she? Could she stand against everything and everyone she had ever known for this man who had transformed her understanding of the world? "It won't come to that," she said firmly. "You're leaving. Now. We both are." Nahuel's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm coming with you." The decision crystallized as she spoke the words, absolute and irrevocable. "South, to Mexico, away from here." "You cannot," he protested. "Your life, your family—" "What life?" Grace interrupted. "Marrying James Porter, becoming the perfect judge's wife, hosting tea parties and pretending I don't see the injustice all around me." She shook her head. "That person died the day I found you in the desert. Your father will never stop hunting us." Nahuel's voice was gentle, but his eyes held the hard truth they both knew. Thomas Whitaker would take his daughter's defection as a personal betrayal. His pursuit would be relentless. "Then we'll go farther beyond his reach." Grace finished binding his wound, her movements sure despite the trembling of her heart. "Can you ride?" Nahuel considered the question with the pragmatic assessment of a man accustomed to pushing through pain. "Not far. Not fast. We don't need fast yet. Just far enough to throw them off our trail." Grace's mind was working rapidly, assessing options, plotting routes. "There's a line of caves in the Red Rock Canyon about 5 miles south. We can hide there until nightfall, then follow the old smuggler's trail across the border." Surprise flickered in his eyes. "You know of this trail?" "My father's been trying to shut it down for years. I've heard him discuss it enough times to know where it lies." A grim smile touched her lips. Sometimes it pays to be the quiet daughter no one thinks is listening. With careful movements, she helped Nahuel to his feet. He leaned heavily against her, his breathing labored but controlled. The wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening if they could avoid infection. "There's a stallion in the gully behind the shack," he told her. "Apache pony. I've been training him these past weeks. He'll bear my weight." Grace nodded. "I'll get our provisions together. We leave in 10 minutes. As she gathered what meager supplies the shack offered, Grace felt strangely calm. The magnitude of what she was doing, abandoning her home, her father, her entire world, should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only certainty, as if every moment of her life had been leading to this decision. The silver medallion hung warm against her skin, a tangible reminder of the choice she was making. Not just for Nahuel, but for herself, for the woman she wanted to become rather than the one others had shaped her to be. When she returned to help Nahuel mount the stallion, a sleek, muscular animal with intelligent eyes and a white blaze down his nose, he caught her hand, his gaze searching hers. "Are you certain, Grace? Once we leave, there is no returning to the life you knew." Grace looked back at the weathered shack, then to the distant shape of Cimarron just visible through the morning haze. The town had been her entire world for 22 years, all she had known, all she had expected to know. "I'm certain," she said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "My life is with you now, wherever that leads." They rode south through thinning scrubland, keeping to the shadows of rock formations where possible. Nahuel, despite his wound, sat straight-backed on the stallion, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Grace led the way, guiding them toward the network of caves she had mentioned. The sun climbed higher, harsh and unforgiving. By midday, the hour her father would be gathering his men in Cimarron, they had reached the mouth of the Red Rock Canyon. Its sheer walls rose on either side, streaked with orange and crimson layers that told the ancient story of the land. The caves were set high in the eastern wall, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail. "We'll rest here," Grace decided, helping Nahuel dismount in the shadow of a massive boulder. "The horses need water, and your wound needs tending." A small spring bubbled from the base of the canyon wall, forming a shallow pool before disappearing underground again. Grace led the animals to drink, while Nahuel lowered himself carefully to sit against the rock. "How far to the border from here?" he asked as she returned to check his bandage. 2 days' ride if we push hard. Longer, given your condition." She frowned at the fresh blood staining the makeshift dressing. "We need to stop this bleeding." Nahuel nodded toward a scrubby plant growing near the spring. "The sage. Crush the leaves to make a poultice. It will help." Grace worked quickly, following his instructions to prepare the herbal remedy. As she applied it to his wound, their eyes met, and despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of their future, she felt a rush of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. "I never thought to find someone like you," Nahuel said softly, reaching up to touch her cheek. "A woman brave enough to see beyond the boundaries of her world." Grace leaned into his touch. "You showed me those boundaries were of my own making, that I could choose." The distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Grace froze, her heart leaping to her throat. "They can't have found our trail so quickly." "Not your father," Nahuel said, his body tensing. "The army patrol. They must have been watching the shack, waiting for me to return." Grace reached for her revolver, her mind racing. The caves were their only chance, defensible, with a clear view of anyone approaching. But Nahuel's condition made the climb a dangerous proposition. "We have to move now." She helped him to his feet, ignoring his grimace of pain. "Can you make it up to the caves?" He glanced at the steep trail, then nodded once. "I will make it." They left the horses in a concealed hollow, hoping the animals would remain quiet. The climb was agonizing, Nahuel's breath coming in harsh gasps as they ascended the narrow path. Twice he stumbled, and Grace feared he would fall, but each time he recovered, driven by the survival instinct that had kept him alive through years of persecution. They reached the largest cave just as the riders came into view at the mouth of the canyon. 4 soldiers in dusty blue uniforms, rifles gleaming in the midday sun. From their vantage point high above, Grace and Nahuel watched as the men dismounted, examining the ground with the practiced eye of experienced trackers. "They'll find our trail," Nahuel whispered. "The horses." As if in answer, Belle whickered softly from her hiding place. One of the soldiers' heads snapped up, his attention drawn to the sound. "Check over there," he called to his companions, pointing toward the hollow where they had left the animals. Grace's hand tightened on her revolver. "If they find us—" Nahuel's expression was grim. "They will not take me alive. And you—" His voice broke. "They will show you no mercy, Grace. Not if they find you with me." The terrible truth of his words sank in. In the eyes of these men, she would be a traitor to her race. Her very presence beside an Apache warrior, an unforgivable transgression. There would be no trial, no chance to explain. Only swift, brutal justice, administered far from any witnesses. The soldiers had found the horses now. One held Belle's reins, examining the saddle with its telltale Whitaker brand. "This is the sheriff's daughter's mare," they heard him call. "What the hell is it doing out here?" "Spread out," ordered another, clearly the leader. "Find them. The Apache can't have gone far, not with that wound." Grace looked at Nahuel, a desperate plan forming. "I'll create a diversion. Draw them away while you escape." "No." His hand closed around her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. "I will not leave you. They won't harm me, not the sheriff's daughter. You believe that?" His dark eyes held hers. "After what you've done, harboring a wanted man, fleeing with him, your father's badge won't protect you now." The soldiers were spreading out, two beginning to climb the trail toward the caves. Time was running out. "Then we make our stand together," Grace said, raising her revolver. Nahuel's hand covered hers, gently lowering the weapon. "There is another way." From inside his shirt, he withdrew a small leather pouch. "Signal smoke. My people use it to communicate across great distances. If my band is anywhere within 20 miles, they will see it and come." Hope flared in Grace's chest. "How quickly?" "Not quickly enough to save us from these soldiers," he admitted, "but perhaps in time to save us from what comes after." Understanding dawned. He was thinking of her father, of the larger posse that would soon join the search. If they could evade the immediate threat, Nahuel's people might reach them before Thomas Whitaker did. Grace nodded. "Do it." While Nahuel prepared the signal, a mixture of herbs and resins that would create a distinctive blue-white smoke, Grace positioned herself near the cave entrance, revolver ready. The soldiers were halfway up the trail now, moving cautiously, rifles at the ready. "When I light this," Nahuel said quietly, "the smoke will be visible for miles. It will draw the soldiers directly to us. How long do we need to let it burn?" 3 minutes, no more." Grace took a deep breath. "Then we'll have to hold them off for 3 minutes." Nahuel's eyes met hers, and in them she saw not fear, but a fierce pride. "We will hold." With a practiced motion, he struck a spark to the mixture. Instantly, a dense column of pale blue smoke began to rise from the cave mouth, drifting skyward in the still canyon air. The reaction from below was immediate. "There, the caves!" shouted one of the soldiers, pointing upward. "It's him, the Apache!" called another, raising his rifle. The first shot splintered rock inches from Grace's head. She ducked back into the cave as more bullets followed, ricocheting off the canyon wall. "They're pinned down," came a voice from below. "Harrison, circle around to the north side. We'll keep them busy from here." Grace peered cautiously around the edge of the cave. The blue smoke continued to rise, forming a beacon that seemed to touch the very sky. 1 minute had passed. 2 more to go. "They're trying to flank us," she warned Nahuel, who nodded grimly. "We must hold this position until the smoke has done its work." Another volley of shots peppered the cave entrance. Grace returned fire, not aiming to hit, but to keep the soldiers at bay. Her revolver had only 5 remaining bullets. She would need to make each one count. Movement to their right caught her attention. The soldier named Harrison, making his way along a narrow ledge that would bring him to the side of their cave. Grace sighted along her revolver barrel and fired. The bullet struck rock near the man's feet, causing him to stumble and press himself against the canyon wall. 2 minutes, Nahuel murmured, his eyes on the thinning smoke signal. The soldiers below had taken cover behind boulders, settling in for a siege. They knew time was on their side. Sooner or later, ammunition or courage would fail the cave's defenders. What they didn't know was that Grace and Nahuel needed only 1 more minute. 1 minute for the smoke to complete its message across the vast New Mexico sky. Harrison was moving again, more cautiously this time. Grace fired once more, forcing him back. 3 bullets left. Almost there, Nahuel said, his voice tight with the effort of remaining upright despite his wound. Fresh blood had soaked through the bandage, but his eyes remained clear, focused. A shot from below struck the cave entrance, sending stone fragments flying. One sliced across Grace's cheek, drawing blood. She barely felt it, her entire being concentrated on the passage of seconds, on the dwindling smoke signal, on the desperate hope that someone, anyone, had seen it. Now, Nahuel said finally. It is done. Grace nodded, already calculating their next move. The south side of the cave system connected to a narrow chimney that led to the canyon rim. If they could reach it undetected, they might escape into the maze of arroyos beyond. We need to... The distinctive crack of a rifle sounded from the canyon rim above them, but it wasn't aimed at the cave. The bullet struck the ground near the soldiers below, sending them scrambling for better cover. "What the hell?" one shouted. "Where did that come from?" More shots followed, a coordinated volley that pinned the soldiers down. Grace peered out cautiously and saw figures moving along the canyon rim, at least a dozen men on horseback, their silhouettes unmistakable against the blue sky. Nahuel's people had answered the smoke signal, and far more quickly than he had dared hope. "Come," he said, a new urgency in his voice. "We must reach the rim while they provide covering fire." They moved deeper into the cave system, Nahuel leading despite his injury, navigating by memory and instinct through the darkness. The chimney was narrow but navigable, a natural shaft that had been widened by generations of Apache using these caves as refuge. The climb was agonizing. Nahuel's wound reopened completely, blood slicking the rocks as he forced himself upward through sheer will. Grace followed, her own muscles screaming with the effort. Her mind focused only on the circle of light above that promised escape. When they finally emerged onto the canyon rim, hands reached down to help them, strong, sure hands that pulled them to safety. Grace found herself surrounded by Apache warriors, their expressions guarded but not hostile as they took in the sight of a white woman in their midst. One man stepped forward, older than the others, with streaks of gray in his braided hair and lines of authority etched into his face. He spoke rapidly to Nahuel in their native tongue, gesturing toward the canyon below, where the sounds of gunfire had ceased. Nahuel replied, his voice weak but steady. Then, switching to English, he said, "Grace, this is Black Knife, my mother's brother. He says the soldiers have retreated but will return with more men." The older man studied Grace with penetrating eyes. "Sheriff's daughter," he said in accented English. "Why you help my sister's son?" Before Grace could answer, Nahuel swayed alarmingly. Two warriors stepped forward to support him as his legs buckled. "He needs help," Grace said urgently. "The wound..." Black Knife nodded once. "We go." "Now." He issued sharp commands, and within moments, the Apache were mounting their horses, preparing to depart. One warrior helped Nahuel onto a pony, while another brought forward a spare mount for Grace. As she swung into the saddle, Grace cast one last look at the canyon below, at the land that had been her home for all her life. Somewhere to the north lay Cimarron, where by now her father would have discovered her absence, would be organizing a search party of his own. Thomas Whitaker would never understand the choice she had made. In his eyes, she would forever be a traitor, a daughter lost to savagery. The knowledge brought a sharp pang of grief, but no regret. Black Knife approached, his pony dancing nervously beside hers. "We ride south," he said. "Cross border before night. No stopping." Grace nodded. "I understand." The old warrior's eyes narrowed. "Why white woman risk everything for Apache? For enemy of her people?" Grace's hand went to the silver medallion at her throat, drawing it out into the sunlight where it gleamed like a star against her dusty clothing. Black Knife's eyes widened in recognition. "Because love knows no borders," she said simply, "and because I finally learned to see with my heart, not just my eyes." The answer seemed to satisfy him. With a curt nod, Black Knife wheeled his pony and moved to the head of the column. Grace urged her mount alongside Nahuel's, reaching out to steady him as they began to move. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely. "We've come too far to lose each other now." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Always," he promised, his dark eyes holding hers with the same intensity that had captured her soul that first day in the desert. "Our rivers have joined, Grace Whitaker. Where you go, I go." As they rode south toward the border, toward a future unknown but chosen, Grace felt the weight of her old life falling away like shed skin. Ahead lay hardship, certainly, danger, undoubtedly, but also freedom, also love. The sun blazed overhead, casting their shadows long across the ancient land, two silhouettes riding side by side, separate yet joined, like streams converging to form a single unstoppable river. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If Grace and Nahuel's journey touched your heart, we kindly invite you to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with someone who loves stories of forbidden love, redemption, and courage. Your support truly means the world to us, from the bottom of our hearts. It keeps us motivated to keep telling powerful new stories full of emotions, twists, and hope. Don't forget, at the end of this video, you'll see a recommendation for another moving story from our channel. Click it and get ready to be surprised and swept away again.